Honourable Member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud to rise today as the Member of Parliament for Durham to speak on this very important debate facing Canada, and that's the budget debate, Mr. Speaker. And what's most important about this debate is it's the first budget for the new Liberal government. It certainly shows areas that they're going to focus on, and as an opposition member, it shows areas that I'm very concerned about for our economic future. And I'll be talking my remarks about that. I will start off in a manner that my mother always taught me to do, is if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. Well, since I am going to be saying something, I was very proud to see the government continue the legacy of Jim Flaherty, who recognized the unique strains on families dealing with young children with disabilities. So I applaud the government for continuing that practice he started and including extra support in their new child benefit for families with disabilities. I certainly know firsthand the late Jim Flaherty's passion on that subject, the impact it's helping for families, and they're continuing that tradition, and I salute them for it. With that out of the way, Mr. Speaker, this budget is built on a house of cards. And we've seen that because the Prime Minister, when he was third-party leader, did not support the running of a deficit. So many of his brand-new Liberal MPs, and we've heard some new first speeches on the budget, and I congratulate them on being here, but they don't know the position he took previously, for many years in fact, was the importance of a balanced budget. Certainly that was the legacy he tried to take from Paul Martin and people like David Dodge, and you'll hear them mentioned a lot, Mr. Speaker. And that was his position, that it's responsible for governments to keep a balanced budget. Then in the middle of an election campaign, Mr. Speaker, really to take advantage of a weak position of a party on the left, they started saying, we will run a deficit, Mr. Speaker, but only a modest deficit, no more than $10 billion. The reality contained in this budget, Mr. Speaker, is there will not be a deficit that's lower than $10 billion over the course of 4 years. $30 billion roughly in their first 2 years, Mr. Speaker, around $14 billion in their final year. So not only did that break the promise about no more than $10 billion, it also broke the promise about balancing within the 4-year term, Mr. Speaker. And I'm going to show in my remarks that some of that spending has no long-term job creation impact for Canada at a time where that has to be a priority. The other House of Cards fallacy this budget was built upon, because it was built upon an election document, and all of our senior civil servants have been essentially giving their marching orders from an election document, Mr. Speaker, and they brought in a senior member to the Privy Council who wrote the election document, Mr. Speaker. I know if the last government had done any of that, there would have been riots in the streets here in Ottawa, but it seems to be accepted by this team. So the other fallacy was that Canada was in a recession, and that's why we needed to do it, Mr. Speaker. Well, none of that was true either, Mr. Speaker, and we saw just a few weeks ago when job numbers were announced and GDP numbers were announced, we'd all like to see more jobs, Mr. Speaker, particularly in Alberta and Saskatchewan and Newfoundland, Labrador in particular, impacted by resource prices. But the economy is growing modestly. So the whole premise for running that no more than $10 billion deficit was also false. And why that's so important, Mr. Speaker, is it is building an economic plan for this new government that's built on a house of cards. And it's putting at risk my children's future by making poor economic decisions. A deficit in the midst of a global recession with a plan to get back to balance was prudent, Mr. Speaker. A massive deficit during a time when the economy is growing with no real emphasis on job creation is reckless. In fact, very little of the infrastructure money will stimulate job creation. In fact, most observers have been profoundly disappointed. While I'm happy there is some infrastructure spending building upon the Build Canada plan of the last government, virtually none of it is stimulative, Mr. Speaker. So no jobs from that. No extension of the Auto Innovation Fund or the Parts Innovation Fund brought forward by the previous government to help Southern Ontario, to help areas in Oshawa and Durham, like my riding, Mr. Speaker, working with industry to modernize, to increase their productivity, and to create jobs. None of that. a broken promise, Mr. Speaker, on the job front to small business by reversing their position on the small business tax rate. Another broken promise, Mr. Speaker. And in fact, almost the unheralded position or unheard of position of not meeting with the Canadian Federation of Independent Business and getting direct budgetary input amid the consultations they claim to have on, I guess, Facebook, to help the hundreds of thousands of independent and small business in Canada. In fact, Mr. Speaker, if you speak with leading economists, they will tell you, amid those tough global years of the recession, it was small to medium-sized employers that helped us make it through, which was why the previous government had a strategic plan to get out of the way in terms of some regulation and red tape for small business, but more importantly, make their tax rates competitive and incent them to hire. Because if every small business hired 2 people, that's equal to a new shift at a plant in Oshawa or Windsor or more, Mr. Speaker. So letting down small business, having no plan for jobs, is a profound concern when we're running billions upon billions in deficit financing for Canada. And, Mr. Speaker, I now will speak for a few minutes about a few areas of particular concern. I am the public safety critic, and what was shocking on a budget delivered the day of the terrible terror attacks in Brussels. In fact, the finance minister was gracious to acknowledge that terrible attack on our friend and ally at the beginning of his speech. But amid $30 billion in new spending, how much was there for frontline public safety and security? 0, Mr. Speaker. In fact, nothing. There are some talk about a few good initiatives. In fact, countering radicalization, those sorts of things, which we support, although we haven't heard anything from this minister, but nothing for frontline members of the RCMP, CSIS, CSC, keeping us safe. That was very concerning, Mr. Speaker, and the minister has not explained why. The Canadian Armed Forces, Mr. Speaker. I'm proudly wearing my RCAF pin. They had an RCAF reception on the Hill this week, and I was proud a lot of members came. We have entered another decade of darkness, Mr. Speaker. I was having dinner last night with some friends of mine that I went to military college with, and we called it Decade of Darkness 2, like the sequel you never wanted to be made, Mr. Speaker. And why it is as bad as the 90s? There's a $3.7 billion cut to the procurement budget. And one of the members from Winnipeg is laughing. That the aerospace industry in Winnipeg is looking to him and this government for some leadership, Mr. Speaker. Yeah. The F-35, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliament Secretary to the Government House Leader on a point of order.
Yeah, on a point of order. The member is trying to impute motives of myself when he indicated that I was laughing at what is a very important industry to my province. I was not laughing. I did say to the member how many F-35s or jets did the member get for the Canadian Forces, but he shouldn't be imputing motives.
Well, it's not a point of order, actually. There are opportunities for members when the time comes on questions and comments that they can perhaps challenge things they've heard in the House, and I'm sure the honourable member is no stranger to doing that when the time comes, when the need arises, if I might say. And so I'm sure he'll have an occasion to perhaps address that point at another time. The honourable member for Durham.
Mr. Speaker, having served myself in Winnipeg and knowing the tremendous history of aviation and of the jobs in that province, it's not something to heckle or do anything about. It's something to support, Mr. Speaker. And the F-35 that he references, they're cancelling it, I think, but the Decade of Darkness, the sequel, the F-35 replaces the old Sea King, you know, that Jean Chrétien canceled, that I flew on, Mr. Speaker, and that we've put lives at risk and cost because of a ill-timed decision to cancel that and cost $500 million in penalties just to cancel it and still need a new helicopter? These are the types of decisions that $3.7 billion cut in new equipment will mean for our men and women, Mr. Speaker. There's also an operational cut between the estimates of 15-16 and the next main estimates of $400 million in operational spending, Mr. Speaker. So the Canadian Armed Forces is going through the exact same period that the Liberal government, when it came in under Prime Minister Chrétien. They also had a defence white paper in '94 We now have a defense review. It was the same sort of window dressing to cut and slash, Mr. Speaker. Finally, on old age security, this is the best example of no plan at all, Mr. Speaker. Rolling back the modest reforms to make sure that this program, which is not a pension but a program financed by the government, addresses demographic change, Mr. Speaker. Our allies, the UK, Australia, going to 67. In fact, Australia going to 70. Most of the countries of Europe, Mr. Speaker. This is a responsible and sensible, evidence-based decision. David Dodge, who the Treasury Board President quoted today, called their move in this budget a backwards step, Mr. Speaker. In a book called The Real Retirement, it was said Canada will not have enough workers in the years ahead, and various incentives, government policies, and employment practices to encourage early retirement will make little sense. Who wrote that, Mr. Speaker? The Finance Minister. Yeah. He's not even following his own advice. So governing is hard, Mr. Speaker. It's about making decisions in our long term. It's making sure there's job opportunities for everyone in Canada, for families, for all families. It's about not burdening our children with debts piled up just with overspending. We've seen that in Ontario with the McGuinty-Wynne governments, Mr. Speaker. This government needs to recognize this and change their course before subsequent budgets put us on the economic shoals and puts our future at risk. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Good job. Questions and comments? Question commentaire? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm wondering if the member might just want to reflect, I guess, more so on some basic sense of commitment. You know, we were both here this time last year, and the leader of the Liberal Party, now Prime Minister, talked a great deal about how important Canada's middle class was and that we needed to invest in our middle class. It ultimately became a part of the election platform for the Liberal Party. Then if you read the throne speech back in December, two highlights really came out of that. The cutback to middle-class taxes, significant cutbacks. We were talking about hundreds of millions of dollars going back into the pockets of our middle class. And we also then came up with the Canada Child Benefit Program. Again, millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars going into and investing in our children. These are two things that really help Canada's middle class. It was an election commitment. It was a part of the platform. And I always thought that the Conservatives would support tax cuts, especially to Canada's middle class. Yet the Conservatives voted against those tax cuts. Can the member please explain why it is the Conservative Party, number one, voted against tax cuts, and why they don't support increasing child benefits for which will, in essence, lift hundreds of thousands of children out of poverty? Why do the Conservatives not support those two initiatives?
Honourable Member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm going to show how this is yet another area that the Liberal Party is misleading Canadians in terms of how they define and reach out to the middle class. The Prime Minister is a little older than I am, but we were both recipients, our families, of the baby bonus, as in fact all members of this House were, because it was a universal program, Mr. Speaker, recognizing the universality and the importance of children and family. That's what our universal child care benefit did. It was everyone. There was also benefits to families for income splitting, for children's fitness, children's arts. They're winding all these programs that apply to all families, Mr. Speaker. And the result that they don't like to tell people, but in Ontario is reality, if there's a family with a nurse or a firefighter or a police officer in the GTA, they're likely worse off under this new plan, Mr. Speaker. And certainly those families took advantage of the tax credits for university, books, arts and fitness. This is what is happening, Mr. Speaker. There's a lot of talk and window dressing with this government, but when you search for the reality, it's not there. That's why the Parliamentary Budget Officer called this budget the least open and transparent in 15 years, Mr. Speaker. That member and his colleagues should tell their constituents why they kept elements out of the budget, Mr. Speaker. That's very concerning.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire? L'honorable député de Sherbrooke.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et je remercie mon collègue pour son discours. Et puis, il y a une chose qui est relevée dans ses commentaires par rapport au budget de la Défense nationale. Et puis, je pense qu'il a bien soulevé le fait que la Défense nationale était négligée par les libéraux. Mais je voulais m'attarder un peu plus à un des aspects aussi du budget qui est négatif, qui a été soulevé et dénoncé par le directeur parlementaire du budget, c'est-à-dire l'opacité du document et des chiffres. En plus de ça, il faut relever aussi que beaucoup de dépenses sont prévues sur un horizon qui va jusqu'en 2021-2022, et c'est le cas de la Défense nationale, qui, pour certaines dépenses, sont même prévues jusqu'en 2021 et 2022, bien après, quasiment rendu à deux élections d'ici. Donc, est-ce que mon collègue pourrait commenter sur cette façon de faire du gouvernement, d'annoncer des chiffres, alors qu'il se trouve finalement à être dépensé dans 2 élections d'ici?
The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank the member from Sherbrooke for his intervention. Certainly he knows, and all members of this House know, the passion I have for the men and women who serve us in the military, Mr. Speaker, in the RCMP. This is an area of profound concern because, as he has said, they've outlined a number of figures already for the military that allow the comparison to the decade of darkness. If you combine the procurement cancellations alongside the operational cuts, and I said the main estimates that we now see before this House show an operational cut of $400 million, an almost $4 billion procurement cut or delay. That amounts to cuts that are really larger than what we saw in total in the 1990s, Mr. Speaker. And with procurement in particular, the longer you don't acquire these aircraft, the higher the cost will be, Mr. Speaker. So with the Sea King was cancelled while I was an officer cadet at the Royal Military College. I served my military time. I became a lawyer. I practiced law. I was elected to Parliament. And my first time on Power and Politics, Mr. Speaker, what was I talking about? The Liberals screwed up Sea King procurement. So if you delay or screw up procurement, Mr. Speaker, you're delaying it for 25 years, you're going to raise the cost on Canadians, and worse, you're potentially putting the lives of the people we asked to serve this country at risk. I ask them to stop that.